So good evening, everyone. I am Amandeep Kalra, co-chair of the Young Trustees and associate architect at Be First. And co-hosting with me tonight is the fellow young trustee, Hannah Benihud, who also runs her own studio. Wave to the crowd. And I'm really excited tonight, actually, to introduce to you Life Not Quite Outside Architecture, which is a 6-part series from the AF Young Trustees, launching today, exploring disciplines outside traditional practice. If you're looking for a fresh perspective because you're stuck in an architecture vacuum and lockdown has really got you thinking, and you, my friends, have come to the right place. Over the next few months, we're going to be hosting a collection of divergent voices from disciplines covering public sector, community development, curation, journalism, academia, climate, and more, with all the speakers having one thing in common, that they all started out studying architecture. So this marathon towards becoming an architect sends people down a path which rarely leaves an opportunity to pause and question the direction it takes them. I know I was a victim of this myself, sliding from part 1 to one job, to part 2, then another job, and then part 3, another job, and suddenly it's been 7 years, if you're lucky and determined, and then you're an architect and you can't quite remember how you got there. Ring any bells? Don't get me wrong, I'm really happy and proud to be an architect, but did I really pause and think about what I wanted? I don't think I did. How many people study architecture but don't plan on becoming an architect? Probably not many. How many people become architects and don't practice as architects? Probably also not that many. And how many times have you heard or said, so-and-so left architecture and joined the dark side? Why do we as architects create this sort of societal pressure that doing anything but architecture when you're an architect or studying architecture is a cop-out? Most of the times we do this to ourselves. If the last year has proven anything to us, is that life gives us enough pressure and we do not need to give this one to ourselves. So this series brings together those voices that at some point have paused and questioned their destination, really thought about how they could apply their skills in different environments, including selfishly myself, and also our panelist and my fellow co-host. So we are kicking off tonight on the subject of public sector. And this is when people say, council, really? Does that mean you get a good pension? And I usually reply with yes, and 30 days of annual leave, thank you very much, which seems to grab people's attention pretty swiftly. So though not long ago, actually, almost half the architects worked in the public sector, and consequently, many worked in municipal projects like schools, libraries, and social housing. That has almost all but faded away, basically, with a few remaining close to retirement architects working in councils on small projects around their borough. And Paul Finch talked about this in an article on the AJ about 4 years ago, really in the context of the National Health Service. And he questioned whether there could be a National Architecture Service, but he concluded likely not. Though today we're seeing more and more architects and graduates thinking about roles in the public sector, which have emerged in a number of ways, really. And one of those ways is public practice, founded by the GLA, which offers professionals who are currently in private sector an attractive route into working for the public sector. And hint, hint, we have a few on our panel tonight. We'll get to in a sec, once I finish off my very short intro. And another is the kind of emergence of these local authority-owned development companies, such as Newham's Poplar Living, and where I'm currently working, Barking and Dagenham's Be First. And these create a sort of quasi-public sector route with growing design teams that many graduates and experienced architects are quite enticed by. The impact of this, the impact architects and designers have in the public sector, personally in my mind, I think is absolutely exponential. And mainly because our public sector is so heavily lacking these skills, but also the changing planning landscape is a real opportunity not to be missed. I mean, I know the impact I think I've had as an architect outside traditional practice has been quite astronomical compared to my experiences in traditional practice. And this is a feeling a lot of my colleagues, I think, echo as well. But there are plenty of different roles in the public sector for architects and students to consider. how do we really know what's out there? Do people really get 30 days of annual leave? And crucially, is publicly owned grass really greener? So I want to discuss all of this and more with our fantastic panel tonight, who have come into the public sector in their own way and will be shedding some light on this. So let's kick off first with Karen Jelenje, founder of Activate the City and currently a regeneration project officer at Hackney.
Hopefully you can hear me. Hi, everyone. Thanks for the intro. So yeah, my name is Karen Jelenje. I'm a designer, and I would say my background's primarily in like architecture and urban design. And I currently work at Hackney Council as a regeneration project officer. And then at the same time, I also run my own sort of practice called Activate the City, and it's a creative social enterprise that's primarily focused on advocating for youth-led community development by working with young people to deliver projects in underused spaces. So in terms of like my journey and how I got into public sector, I studied my part one a long time ago at Sheffield University. And then when I graduated, basically, I think I found third year really tough. And then when I graduated, I kind of like, that was my sort of pause and thinking about whether I wanted to continue with architecture. And at the same time, it was kind of a forced pause as well, because I think back in 2012, I'm from the north, so most people kind of moved down to London, and around that time there was a lot of like unpaid internships. And I just remember thinking like that was not something that I wanted to do personally, or didn't really have the resources to do that. And then that's when I started searching for other roles and just thinking about what I really wanted to do. And my first sort of job out of uni actually was working in supply chain, which was quite interesting. But literally that was like the first sort of job that I was offered after applying for like loads of architecture jobs and being offered unpaid internship. So I did that for a couple of years. And then, yeah, I was offered like a graduate scheme at a housing association in London. And really that was like quite eye-opening, because I got to like work on kind of the delivery side of things. So not just working on like concept, working with architects, but really like seeing how schemes get delivered. And then I decided to go back to uni at that point after working 2 years and do like an urban planning degree. And during that time, I also did a placement at an urban design practice and really got interested in kind of like cities and urban design and kind of the link between people, cities and communities and how that comes together. And following that, I basically, graduated again from doing my master's, and then I moved to Bristol and ended up working for like an urban design consultancy practice. And again, that's another point when I kind of paused and thought about what I really wanted to do, because the work that I was doing there was not like really serving the community that I come from personally, and it wasn't sort of anything that I was really interested or passionate about. And then following that, basically, that was my first kind of stint into public sector, and it was through a role at the council there that was around a refugee resettlement. So working as like a project manager, delivering houses for like refugee families that were being resettled to Bristol. And it was working with like it was working with the UNHCR and also the Home Office and Bristol City Council. So that was like my first step into kind of looking at how different agencies work together. And I was really interested about that kind of side of things. And following that, I basically entered working for Hackney as a project officer. So mainly at the moment, I work on estate regeneration schemes and I'm focusing mainly on their large estate projects and long-term project delivery. But I think what I really like about it is being able to collaborate with like different like consultants and learning the fact that, you know, the built environment is made up of so many different specialisms. So yeah, that's me in a nutshell.
Karen, that's so amazing hearing your journey to now. I have a question for you. I think it's really interesting that you do activate the city alongside your work with Hackney. And I wonder, sometimes that's not so easy to do when you're in an architectural practice to have your own work. How have your employers at Hackney, have they been supportive of Activate the City? Has it helped with what you've been doing? Have you sort of picked stuff up in your role that's fed into that? How's that relationship?
Yeah, I think that's what one thing I'd say about public sector, and that's what surprised me is like kind of how flexible it is. Like if I worked in practice, for instance, I couldn't see myself being able to like work on two things at once or run my own sort of design practice. So I think what I've really like been surprised about is how like sort of flexible they've been. Like I was also, whilst I was kind of like doing both things, I was also doing like a course for 6 months. So having that flexibility of time and just being able to have a bit of a work-life balance has been really good. And in terms of like working for councils, I think like working in the public sector has been good to kind of understand how councils work with the projects that I'm doing for Activate the City, and just understanding kind of the roles and the people that you need to reach out to. Because basically, the projects that I'm doing now with Activate the City are local to my local council is Harrow, so being able to like penetrate that council much more easier because of understanding how like the structure is around who you need to get attention from. So yeah, that's been really good.
You've seen under the hood, you know how it all
Seen
works.
under the hood. Got some insights.
Yeah. Awesome.
Thanks, Karen. Yeah, I think your points about like forced pausing, I think, is important as well. And I think the lockdown itself, for me, is a forced pausing for many people. And I think it's a great opportunity for people to really think about what they're doing and what they do next. So next, I'd like to introduce Krish Nathaniel, who is a principal urban designer for Hackney and previously a policy advisor at the MHCLG.
Thanks, Steve. Hi, everyone. Yeah, so I'm currently principal urban designer at Harrow. Prior to that, I was working within the housing diversification division at MHCLG. So there I was working on housing policy. It was a team of community-led housing, self and custom build, so kind of housing that isn't the mainstream developer-led approach. And then I was also managing the Home of 2030, which was a competition that stretched across our department, Department of Health, and Department of Business and Energy as well. So it had a few different agendas to do with housing for older people, to do with housing that addressed the climate crisis as well. But yeah, I mean, I started in that role at MHCLG kind of fresh out of my master's at CSM, and I just applied for it. Basically, I was looking at a bunch of roles in central government, considered a few in Department of Culture, Media and Sport that were kind of architecture related, but MHCLG seemed like a good fit in terms of my skill set and having an architecture background. But yeah, prior to my master's, I was working in private practice here in London and in a freelance capacity, and then also in private practice in Brazil as well. But yeah, I think probably my journey to the public sector was maybe driven perhaps by my master's, and kind of, I don't know if anyone on the call is from St Martin's, but I certainly think it's like a course where it is an architecture, course, but you're looking at much more expansive issues in a way, and so kind of distilling that into kind of the design of a building, or heading back into private practice didn't seem like the right approach for me. When I think and I think this is probably true of most masters, you're dealing with a lot of different issues, kind of social, cultural, economic, and I thought that the public sector would be a kind of a good space to kind of be close to the levers of change and get to work with a whole host of different people, and certainly in central government and also in local government, you do get to meet a real swathe of different people and practitioners, and whether they're health professionals or specialists in low carbon technologies, all these things that are kind of around architecture. You really get a chance to kind of engage with those things. I think that's kind of my journey. And then what I do in my current role at the moment is I partly work with planning teams, so I guess in a kind of an advisory context, so commenting on applications, major planning schemes, master plans from a design perspective, but also working with Regen and also working with the housing teams and policy to develop guidance, so design guidance, housing guidance as well, and also managing the design review panel for Harrow as well. So yeah, I mean that's what I'm doing 9 to 5, and then 1 or 2 days a week I'm working at Glamorous Adventure Playground in Tower Hamlets. So I'm kind of splitting my time between a desk job and something that's a bit more hands-on.
I think it seems really interesting that sort of similar to Karen, you have another sort of outlet for creativity. Are there, when you're in public sector and you're doing stuff like lots of these like design review panels, does it ever make you kind of want to feel like, I wish I could do this myself, I want to like jump in, or do you actually prefer, feel more comfortable with this sort of overseeing role, looking at different schemes and commenting that way?
Yes and no, Hannah. I think sometimes I do wish it was more of a kind of a workshop, as opposed to, you know, when you have a meeting with a planner and you're there, and the architects and the applicants there. And I mean, yeah, there's certainly been times when I've been kind of itching to sketch something out or draw something, just because it's often just quicker, isn't it, just to convey that. So I feel like maybe there's a space for, I mean, it's not like a public-private partnership thing, but I do feel like there's scope for kind of more workshop style sessions, because obviously from a local authority perspective, we're trying to get certain things out of a development, kind of policy related. And yeah, I mean, if they can align as much as possible with the architects and the client's vision, I mean, then everyone, you know, it's kind of working for everyone. So yeah, I mean, I think something that was closer to a workshop as opposed to a meeting might be interesting. And I think sometimes design review panels are that. I think they've become a bit more formal since COVID, unfortunately, just because it's all online. You're following the agenda, all this kind of thing. So hopefully, I mean, as we kind of settle into this new working routine, it'll become a bit less formalized again.
And maybe as more designers move into similar roles to what you're doing, that environment will sort of naturally happen as well. So that's quite interesting.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah.
Thanks, Krish. I think some of the things you started saying I completely resonate with. All the different hats you wear, I always find it really difficult to describe what I do, because, you know, as you said, you manage the QRP, you run all the things, you run other roundtables. There's so many hats you wear in your small role. We have a team of almost 8 people trying to do some of those things spread out. So I totally get where you're coming from. So finally, we have Analisa Pollock, who is an associate at Panoy & Prasad, and is also an alumni of public practice, having previously worked at Enfield Council.
Hello, everyone. Yes, so hi. So as Deep mentioned, I'm an associate at Panoy & Prasad Architects, and I'm very happy to be here tonight and join the discussion. Like Krish, I took part in the public practice programme last year, and I took a year's sabbatical from my current position at Panoy & Prasad Architects. I was working in the housing and regen team, and my role was actually as a senior architect, but my day job was actually very different to my current role in practice. As well as being kind of client side on a number of housing projects, including working on large scale kind of regeneration schemes. I was also involved in kind of council-led development. So I was reviewing different council-owned sites and seeing where we could have affordable housing. So kind of carrying out feasibility studies in-house within the council. In terms of why I decided to work for the public sector, I first heard about public practice kind of a year before I applied, and I'd been in private practice for about 7 years by that point, mainly working in London. I was at Panoy & Prasad for a few years before that, and also in Stockholm. And I just finished my first built project, which was a secondary school. And it kind of gave me a chance to kind of pause and think what I really wanted to do. I'd been on the treadmill that Deep mentioned of kind of architectural education, and I thought public practice seemed like a really great opportunity at that point. In terms of kind of my aims in architecture, I was always really interested in working kind of for the public goods, and I didn't really see many opportunities kind of earlier on in my career to work for the public sector, and wasn't really sure and kind of a way to get involved. And I was also much more interested in how design, doesn't have to be a kind of a glamorous kind of magazine-based thing. Actually, small design interventions can make a huge impact on people's lives. I think it's also been in London and practicing for a few years, I was starting to get a bit frustrated at some of the kind of spatial inequalities I was seeing, and particularly around housing provision, and how as architects we get involved at a point of a project we don't necessarily have opportunity to impact change. So being able to kind of move upstream in the process and actually be involved in more of a strategic a point in the project, and being able to help on brief forming really appealed to me as well, and particularly around the climate emergency, and looking at how we can, as architects, actually have an impact on master plans on a larger kind of scale projects. In terms of my current role, so I did go back to Panorama Facade after working at Enfield for a year. The reason I went back actually was that the estate regeneration project I was working on before I left came back on, and it was kind of an opportunity to bring all the learning from Enfield back into private practice. I think that there's a lot of benefits from moving between the two that I've seen already. So I think, well, it'd be great to see more people being able to traverse kind of between the private and the public sector. So yeah, I think that's probably it for introductions for me. Thanks.
Thanks, Anna. That's really interesting that you moved between back and forth. I never really considered that as a sort of career trajectory that you could go back and forth. Once you sort of returned to practice, was it seen as a sort of an asset, the fact that you had then had this time in public practice? And did you kind of feel like your colleagues maybe that were still on that treadmill had sort of overtaken you, or did you feel like you had gathered different information that had made you a more unique person to hire?
Yeah, it's a really good point, because I think one of the concerns I had going into it was, would I forget how to design? And that might sound silly, but I guess because you're designing every day and then suddenly you're doing something a completely different job, really. And actually, I think it can only benefit you. I mean, if going back to architectural practice, this kind of skills you're learning working in the public sector are really valuable. And it's not just kind of to get work, actually. It's more about kind of understanding your clients, understanding how public sector projects work. And it will make you a much better architect, actually, in the end, I think, and more hireable. So I think, yeah, I was kind of a bit concerned, would it actually make me less hireable? Actually, I think it does make you more hireable in the end.
Mm.
Yeah, so I think that's a really good point, that between all three of you, I think one thing we've seen is that all of you have taken such meandering or quite different ways in your own ways to the public sector. Between Karen, you having a number of different roles actually before working in private practice, and then doing a master's and then coming back, and Krish, you going straight in. You're like, right, I'm done masters now, and we don't. You having quite a clear idea that this is what you want to do, and already know directly, right, central government. And even for me, I think that one of the challenges people face is navigating job titles. Like for you coming out of part two, looking at those job titles on central government roles and going, yeah, that looks like something an architecture graduate could do. I think that in itself it is quite a challenge. So, and Analisa, obviously you going back and actually enriching your practices culture, I think, with the knowledge you bring, particularly on the state regen projects. And obviously you've been involved in kind of understanding the voting, the balloting process, and that in itself, I think, on large estates is really interesting. So all of you have got some really interesting things and really interesting experiences, which I'm sure everybody here tonight will definitely be learning from. So feel free, everybody, to start sending through some questions. We're just gonna have our own discussion because everyone's so great, but we will get to your questions as well, don't you fear. I'm going to start off with one, and then maybe Hannah, you can throw some of your own ones, but we'll probably start with, I like starting with heavier stuff and working my way down to less heavier stuff. So one of the things I've found is the impact of politics when you work in the public sector. So how do you feel, might start with Krish actually, how do you feel politics has influenced or is influencing your role? Probably quite significantly because you're working more for central government, or worked for central government before, but differently so now, I guess.
Yeah, I think in my current role, there's definitely less. There's more local politics, which in a sense is kind of a different thing. And I'm mostly coming in contact with politicians when major applications are going to planning committee, and you know, there are objections and councillors having issues with kind of parking, which is always the thing. But you know, often very valid concerns about tall buildings, about the effect of co-living we've seen recently, particularly in Harrow, and kind of the potential damage it could have on the borough. But yeah, I mean, central government, I mean, you know, I certainly felt conflicted at times and complicit at times, I guess. Particularly, I guess, not to kind of, well, to say it quite diplomatically, with kind of the current government we have at the moment, and the last, you know, decade or so. I think how I kind of squared it with myself in a sense was being in that role, MHCLG, and being part of the civil service. You're in a sense there to advise ministers, so it's not, you know, most ministers aren't, you know, definitely aren't specialists in housing or any field that they kind of take. So you're doing the research, you're meeting with the advocacy organisations and the kind of sector organisations to build up kind of cases and to build up research to show that, you know, we should be going in this direction or this direction. So that's quite interesting in feeling like you can kind of affect some change there, or kind of sway some opinions. Yeah, it's a really difficult one, and I think that was part of my reason for going from central government to local government, is just feeling a bit too divorced from kind of actual issues and from places, and you know, having an architectural training, you kind of want to be on the ground in a sense, and I knew I wouldn't be designing, but I think kind of being in basically Whitehall was whilst interesting because you're looking at issues at a national scale. I think, you know, sometimes the politics of it does take over a bit, and I think local government, where you're dealing with councillors who are very much is more in a sense of direct democracy, because you're working with councillors who are very attentive to residents on the whole and very conscious of local concerns, and so you do have a feedback, which is quite nice to kind of be a part of and respond to. And obviously there's wider things like, you know, consultation and public engagement that you do. We do at both levels, but I think it's a bit more clear the effect at a local government level.
Yeah, no, completely. My mind exploded when I first realized how much of a difference politics makes in public practice, especially if the local authority's vision aligns well with the mission of the political local leaders. It makes a huge difference to the power that local authority has to carry things out. And where there is not that case in assimilation, it actually makes it very difficult for things to happen. And it's really interesting, I think. You don't really see that sat back being an architect doing a few, you know, even if you're working for a local authority, you're not generally always exposed to that, you know, pulled in here and there for a cabinet meeting or something, but quite not really exposed to that. Any of the other panelists want to jump in on that question? Put your hand up and you can just go. Yeah, Analisa.
Yes, I think in Enfield, as a designer, I was quite insulated in my role from local politics because I was just focusing on more on the design side. But one thing that was a bit strange was being apolitical. acting as a civil servant. I just hadn't really thought about it before I was in the role, that actually you can't really have, your own political views or express them, on social media or anything like that. So it's just something that's interesting to be aware of, because we are quite active politically to go into these kind of roles. And I also think the effect of local politics depends on the borough, but in Enfield, it's a Labour borough and obviously a Labour mayor and quite stable. So actually that made things probably a bit easier than other boroughs would be. But in terms of politics, I mean, I was, as you mentioned before, quite involved in the ballots. We were going through a ballot process on the state regeneration, and that is a very kind of political thing in itself. And spending a lot of time talking about, voting ballots and all that sort of thing is not really what I thought I'd be doing when I went into the year, but actually was extremely interesting, and is something that we're now looking at now in my practice on the state regeneration projects, even when it's not needed. So yeah, it's interesting. I think politics does influence everything we do, but you kind of get that different perspective from working in local authority.
Yeah, and I think the research you came out with clearly has been quite useful for a lot of people, and not just Enfield. We've had you present to us in our office, so yeah, though that was something you didn't really expect to be doing it, actually the wider impact of your research was much appreciated and felt by lots of other authorities and designers. So that's really good.
Can I give you guys a question from the audience? Patricia, she can't turn her mic on, so I'm going to ask it for her. But basically, she would like some advice on how best to find a job within local authorities or the public sector, being aware that not everyone has jobs as like an in-house architect. So how best is it to go about looking for appropriate roles?
I would probably start by saying being a bit more open about what kind of role you do, because I think with public sector, what I found is that there's lots of like entry-level roles that you can get into that might be related to like a regeneration or housing department, but just being open to doing like an entry-level role and perhaps moving into sort of the ideal role that you want, and because a lot of councils also kind of recruit within as well, so there's a lot of internal recruitment and jobs that open up. So yeah, trying to find a role that might be slightly related, but that's entry level is probably one way that I would start.
Great.
Yeah, I'd second that. I think once you're in, it can be relatively fluid, and if you're working in a team like regen or policy or housing, and they're kind of made aware of your skill set, I think you should be able to, if it's a good team, touch wood, be able to kind of either have a kind of a custom role or to just do something beyond your initial job description.
That's really good point. We're gonna try to, if possible, and I've said that we would do it as part of the resources, to try and demystify some public sector roles, and maybe give like as part of something we publish after this is just a little, here's a job title, roughly what you can expect to be doing this on this, and what qualifications you may need to have, just to also help everybody out. But as you heard, I think it's about giving it a try and seeing if the job sounds like something you may be remotely interested in. Hannah, do you have one of your own questions, or do you want to continue hitting the audience? We've got another few coming in as well.
Yeah, there's a few more. I'm busy reading questions, so I'm like not in question mode. But Holly has got a question, which I think is quite interesting, about architectural education. If you would like to ask it, Holly, maybe we can get you unmuted.
Hi, can you hear me?
Oh, fabulous. Hi, Holly.
Hi, thank you so much to all of the speakers who've spoken today. It's been really, really insightful. I just wanted to ask kind of a two-part question. And I was going to ask, why do you think that there isn't as much encouragement to go into public sector or planning, council-related design jobs in comparison to, say, working in an architectural practice? I'm currently an architecture student, and I would say that this is probably the first time that I've even been introduced to possibly doing jobs in the public sector field. And there is sort of a glamorization and an appraisal of jobs in going straight into an architectural practice in terms of work. And I was wondering if you guys have any examples of ways that the architecture system the architectural education system could possibly encourage students to think about this area as well, because it is such a large area and it affects all of us. It doesn't affect just the top 1% or people thinking about, you know, building houses, or people who can afford to build some of to build some larger work on or build larger construction projects. Sorry. So my question is, do you have any examples of ways that the architecture system could encourage students from the outset to get involved in these different areas?
Any of our panelists want to kick off? Oh,
yeah,
Karen.
I would probably say, like, I think during my master's degree, I actually got to do like a placement, but I think in undergrad, when I was doing my part one, I think there wasn't any sort of, you know, integration with the course with actually like working for the public sector. So I think that could be like one way that more students can get like exposure to what, like, how public sector works, or what departments they are and what kind of jobs are available that might be complementary to like their skills. So I think that's probably one way I would say, just having that exposure, because I didn't, before going into kind of public sector, I had no idea kind of how councils worked at all. Like, I kind of had this idea of like, I'll work in a design practice and that's it, cool. But there's a lot of other roles that kind of, if you're kind of passionate about, say, communities, you could work in sort of community engagement. So there's so many roles that we're not really told about. So I think, yeah, that's one way of kind of getting more students kind of engaged in public sector.
I think we need to run this lecture series throughout the UK universities, don't we? That's what I'm feeling, Holly. I think you're right that it's a really tough one. How do you, because going into private practice, you effectively need to get your year out experience, you need an RIBA or accredited company, which normally public sector practices. If you're doing a totally different role, you won't be able to use that. If you still want to become an architect and use the route of public sector, that in itself I think is quite challenging, because you might not be able to get the PDRs you need to go on to your next stage, to the stage after. Right. So I think there's definitely a challenge there, which I think can start to be addressed. Krish, did you have something to say to that?
Yeah, I mean, I'd say that's true. I think there's perhaps still a lack of kind of true design roles in the public sector, and you know, kind of local authority architects being one, for an example. And I think it is definitely changing, and we're seeing more and more. But yeah, I still think there's a way to go in kind of building up the capacity and kind of the roles within local authorities for design, you know, having dedicated design teams. So I think, I mean, hopefully it will just continue to increase, although I guess COVID's kind of thrown us a curveball a bit. But yeah, I wonder if there's a bit of a push-pull in terms of universities perhaps not suggesting this as a route, because maybe there aren't the kind of I guess, you know, solid design roles that there are in the private sector at the moment. But yeah, I think doing a job that's kind of, or picking a role that's slightly away from design might enable you to actually either create a role for yourself, or to kind of develop that capacity for a design team. And I generally think there's like a lack of junior design roles as well in the public sector. I work with a junior designer, but I think that's quite rare. I'd be interested to know what other people on the panel think.
I mean, I would just say holler at, we're looking for a part 2 in newly qualified architects. So just putting it out there, feelers out there, and that post has gone up 2 days ago. So not, but you're absolutely right, Krish. Even we were debating this quite a lot about whether we introduce that role. And I think it's, you know, if a part 2 comes on to a place like this and they're interested in still qualifying, can we feel as an organization we even give them the right experience, because we're not really an RIBA chartered practice in that sense. So does that person effectively want to take a risk on, they might be able to get all that experience, and then, but actually, is the system geared up to actually still allow them to become an architect? It ties in quite nicely to a question I think somebody else has asked in the audience, I think, from Kirsty, which basically talks about whether the hindrance of not having the title as an architect, or can that actually be a hindrance working in the public sector if you're not, if you don't have that title? I guess between Krish, I think you did a master's, you didn't do your part 3, right? So you can definitely answer that. Karen, I think maybe similarly to yourself as well, you could both answer to that. But I think generally, not necessarily. We've got urban designers on our team that have done masters and the head of design roles. So from my experience, it's not a hindrance. But I'd be interested to hear your thoughts, Karen, how you felt, if in your role at all, actually, you felt that not being a qualified architect has hindered you in any way in your roles.
No, not at all, really. I would say personally, I don't know what everyone else's experience is, but I would say like it's also about thinking about the bigger picture of project delivery. It involves more than just like architects as well. It involves like a whole team. So having different disciplines is also like a great thing. So I think like for me in my role, I think it's helped that I studied architecture, but I wouldn't say there's lots of people in my team who have come from different disciplines. And if anything, we learn more from each other through the different kind of perspectives we've had from our training. So yeah, I would say like in terms of like council departments, especially regeneration and housing, the more like diverse disciplines they are, the better outcomes for like projects, rather than just having like at Hackney's really focused on design. There's a few architects in the team, but there's also people who've come from like, you know, quantity surveying backgrounds, asset management, who bring in a different perspective of, you know, like designing projects and what things to look out for. So yeah.
I think also I just remind me of something of a project that I was on recently, and they didn't know I was an architect, and there was different clients and different people in the room, and they caned us. They caned architects. They really had to go with them about how they didn't like them. And I was thinking, oh my God, who knew this is what they say behind our backs? So like, I think sometimes, you know, not being an architect can actually be quite helpful. So I wouldn't worry too much about the title all the time, for sure.
That's the problem though, isn't it? Too much emphasis on the root and the title, and then it ends up, it takes us where we are, and then and everybody wants it so much because the inherent value attached to it from day one.
Yeah,
We've got loads more questions coming in. I mean, I think we'd rather plow on with audience questions than our own ones, because that's who this talk is for, I think. So you got any other ones you picked out, Hannah?
yeah, there's one from Holly, which is quite interesting. Oh no, we've had Holly. Have we had Holly?
Yes.
Oh, sorry, I meant, one moment. I got too distracted listening to you all. This is the problem.
All right.
Let's go to have we had Kirsty?
Yes, I kind of shoehorned her question in.
Yeah, let's go with China. China, are you there?
Hello.
Hello.
Hi everyone. My question might be a bit confusing, but so starting off in uni, I feel like okay, first of all, actually, you guys were all incredible and quite inspiring. So I don't waste your time. Yeah, we were in university. We always used to bang on about like social value, and coming into practice, I do get to deal with social value quite a bit because my practice does a lot of work with engaging with young people. And we're always trying to sort of straddle the barrier between sort of like collecting data, which is quite a quantitative thing to do when you're like trying to connect with a community, but at the same time being qualitative and actually really connecting with people and understanding their experiences and how design can bring social value. So I just wondered about like what processes you guys have come across in the public sector for actually like proving social value for a community. I know it's quite difficult. It's this whole thing of like connecting social things with the material world and it's a bit of a blur. But anything would be helpful.
Can I kick off with Analisa on that one? I like picking on people.
Sure. Hello. That was, yes, it's a very interesting and quite tricky question, I think. In terms of quantifying social value, we spoke about this a lot at Enfield actually, and we were trying to develop a social value toolkit specific to the estate regeneration project I was working on. And it was trying to encompass like just a very specific social value to that estate. And then we were going to have a workshop that should happen just after I left with the community specifically about social value. I think it's very difficult to quantify. I mean, in terms of how we were trying to encapsulate it, we were trying to include social value percentage in all of our tenders and procurement as well on that estate. So for example, the design team procurement, the contractor procurement as well, and to ensure that everyone had that kind of contractual obligation to be committed to social value. One way you can do it is, for example, if you're looking at procuring an architecture practice, you can say, actually, you have to, or can you take on an apprentice from the estate to work with you for a period of time during the project? And in that way, you actually bring in someone on to get trained during the project. And that's kind of bringing a quantifiable social value, I guess. So yeah, it's a difficult question. There are kind of different ways of measuring it. I know there's kind of like the TOMS system, which is quite techie and used by contractors more than kind of in the role that I was doing. One other thing actually is that the RIBA, I don't know if you know, they've developed a social value toolkit as well. Is that, you've probably come across that before, but that's what we were kind of referencing when we were developing our own social value toolkit on the estate. So yeah, my answer is there are lots of different ways to do it. I don't have a set answer for you, but it is very important that we kind of consider this throughout the project.
Thanks.
I think the really interesting thing in the public sector is the influence, because you're a public sector organization commissioning so much work, often, especially if it's a more development side, you're spending so much money, you actually have the power to be able to stipulate what all of these, be it architects or contractors that are working for you, you have the power to influence that in the procurement process and be able, exactly what Analisa said, you can try and, part of your assessment criteria, say, well, this is what I want my architects working with me to do. We want to have this apprenticeship or this role, and we want our contractors to do 100 social days, or kind of partner up with local colleges and run interviews. Like, we can stipulate those things as being a client. Basically, you can control those things, and I think in that way around, you have more power to be able to decide who the best person is for the job, not based on the cheapest person, not just based on quality, but actually how they feel they contribute to the social value of the place they're operating in. So I found that actually quite good, but it does require some unraveling at times as well.
Can we go to Emma Twain? I think she's got a really interesting question, and I've thought about this before. So yeah, Emma, if you're there, I would love for you to ask your question.
Hi, can you hear me? I don't
know.
So I work for a company. We work for almost exclusively local authority clients. And we've experienced a huge amount of staff shift in the client teams that we work for across particularly London local authorities, to the point where we've had sort of on one project that's not even on site yet, we've had 4 separate project officers for that same project. And every time there's, a whole process of going through all of the journey to date. So I'd be really interested to know what the group have experienced of that and if it's impacted on their experience at all.
Anybody want to jump in there?
I do think it's a really, really big issue, and I think me and Annalise will know that kind of public practice, one of their stated aims is to kind of prevent that turnover, that really high turnover in local authorities. I'm not entirely sure why it happens. I think partly it's to do with the amount of agency staff. I also think what happens when people leave is that, and what we kind of were trying to address at MHTLG was something called they called it corporate memory, which is a very annoying way of just saying kind of tracking what you're doing. So when someone leaves, if someone leaves, even if they take sabbatical, if they go on maternity leave, people can easily pick up what they've done. And I don't really think that those processes are there. I don't think local authorities are particularly good at doing that. There are issues with kind of how organizations are run, how local authorities are run. But I think if something like that was used more, just actually having proper summaries and breakdowns of projects, who was working on what, I think that change would be a lot less disruptive. But yeah, I mean, I hope people are staying in the public sector more than kind of leaving. But I think it is quite easy to hop from authority to authority and take that knowledge with you.
I found that's a big one as well, because public sector does encourage quite a lot of internal recruitment. So you not only get moving across authorities, somebody might be working as a development manager, sees an amazing opportunity that's a complete sideways trajectory to what they're doing. And because local authorities encourage retaining staff internally, that actually you might find that very quickly that person is just doing something totally different that they found really exciting, and they're encouraged to do so being in a public sector organization. But totally with Krish, I think there is more work to be done in sort of handover processes to ensure smoother continuity. I know when I worked in private practice, this happened on projects I worked on, and it was just an absolute pain with transfer of knowledge and information, and you almost felt like you started from stage zero again when you had a new, and they completely have a different opinion of the scheme so far and completely change what you've done. And that's not how it should be. And I think that there is this idea of kind of individuals and their opinions versus actually how a clienting process should be done. So I think there's a really good question and really lots of challenges there. One thing that's come up like 3 or 4 times, Hannah, before, is the part 3 thing. We maybe didn't seal this off properly.
Maybe we can go to Betty, because she, I think, put something about the part 3, and then she's got something also interesting about FAF. So maybe she could do a little combination.
Hey everyone. Yeah, it's been so interesting hearing all your experiences and how you got into public sector, and really inspiring as well. I guess the part 3 thing was kind of a riff off of what Sarah, Beth and Kirsty were talking about, and I guess it's kind of a debate that a lot of people post part 2 go through as to whether or not to kind of stick it out in practice, get your part 3 under your belt, or whether it's okay to branch off and maybe never get your part 3. And I wonder if the question would be, like, if you were to do that, like, would you find that it's something that would limit you if you were going into the public sector, and or is it a risk that's worth taking in terms of being in a career that you enjoy and care about more?
Who would like to kick that off? So, Analisa.
Yeah, as someone who's done part 3, I got part 3 done and then worked for years and then went to public sector. I don't think it would hinder you that much in a public sector role, not doing your part 3. I think you could easily, be very successful in that role. I guess the problem is then if you want to go back into private practice. And I do also think that some of the part 3 knowledge is actually really helpful in the role that I was doing, particularly because it was a lot around procurement and kind of also making procurement work for you and getting the most out of it. And I think having that part 3 knowledge actually does really help. But it's not so much about the title, really. I think it's more about that, actually the actual course is actually quite helpful in that, in my opinion. But yeah, I wouldn't say it's completely essential. Definitely not for the kind of roles you'll be doing.
Do you find that people take you more seriously because you have the architect title?
I don't, not within local authority. A lot of people didn't really understand what an architect was necessarily that I was working with, to be honest. I had to do quite a lot of explaining about what architects did, and maybe some people did, especially if we're working with developers or contractors and saying, no, actually, I'm an architect. That does actually carry some weight. But on the other side, I think if you were an urban designer within a local authority, you'd probably get just as much respect, to be honest, because that's a role that they actually understand, and can be a really quite senior role of running the planning department or the design department in a local authority.
Yeah, I agree with you completely, Analisa. I think, I would quite like to do part 3 at some point. I've got six sevenths of the way through, and I think part of the reason is because there's really valuable parts of part 3 that I don't know, and if I do stay in a public sector role long term, which I plan on, I think it would be really, really helpful. But I think, Betty, I would say only if you're looking to be an architect in the public sector, would kind of not having part 3 hinder you. I think most other roles, you do fine and do well with the masters.
I think that's the perfect distinction from how we were discussing it earlier. I don't think the role I'm currently in I would be in if I hadn't already qualified as an architect in private practice, because it accelerated the positions I was able to take when I moved into public practice. But so I think that's just the nail on the head, really. It won't hinder you getting into public practice or public sector, but if you're looking for very specific design focused roles, or actually thinking about a more leadership led position potentially in the future, I would say it can definitely help accelerate that. And I think tied exactly to Annalisa's points about the knowledge you gain about procurement, running a practice, how to engage with people, contracts, all of this stuff I'm doing. I've definitely been exposed to this loads more working in the public sector than I have ever, looking at fees, contracts, dealing with procurement, tendering. I hardly touched any of that in private practice, but all of that part 3 knowledge definitely came into use when we're working in the public sector.
I think as what Kirsty McMullen just raised a good point in the chat about the problem being that you qualify, and then if you go into the public sector, you're having to pay ARB membership and you're not really using it. So I don't know what you guys think about that.
I mean, I got Enfield to pay for mine. So you probably, if you show the value, saying, I'm bringing this value as a qualified architect, actually, they're professional. They should pay for that, really, as professional accreditation.
I'm still trying to get parking to pay for it.
Got to expense that deep. What are you doing?
I know. We still have loads of questions, but I like to finish things on time. And what we will do though is I think we will follow up with all of these questions back to the panel, hopefully, and maybe merge a few together and put them back out as posts. Before we do go, I would like to get some very short single top tips from our panel on how to get into the public sector and how to stay there. We will also push these out as posts in case anybody misses them. So maybe let's start with Karen first, and then Krish, and then Analisa.
Yeah, I would say top tip about getting into the public sector is, as I said earlier, like just being open to maybe entry-level roles, and then trying to kind of weave your way into the role that you want to be in, or just pursuing your interests basically within the public sector and seeing what finds you, whether it's design or whether it's kind of like urban design. And in terms of staying there, like I think a lot of people, like my experience, a lot of people move between boroughs, so there's a lot of flexibility to do that. So just getting that experience within different boroughs and kind of what projects they're doing, which all are quite interesting. It kind of helps shape your CV and helps you kind of become more like experienced in the public sector that way.
Krish?
Yeah, on a very practical level, I'd say if you're looking to apply to a role, take a really, really good look at the public sector application process, because it's generally across the board the same. They use strengths and competencies. It's kind of a very formulaic process, and there are set things and set questions and set ways of answering those questions. So it's, obviously you're not bringing your portfolio along, which is, I guess if you've got background in architecture, a bit jarring. But yeah, I'd look into that, and there's loads of stuff about, you know, how to apply and how to deal with those things. And then staying there, I'd say just try and meet as many people from as many different teams as you can, and propose things. You know, I think generally people are quite receptive for little, you know, small projects, different ideas. Yeah, there's definitely can be a shortage of imagination, so I think that's really where your value as an architect or a spatial practitioner comes in, really.
And Analisa.
I'm going to say the very obvious thing first, which is apply for public practice. As I obviously both Krish and I have done, it's a really great way to get involved, and they give you a lot of support during the year, which is really helpful. I think other than that, if there's an organisation or a particular authority that you're really interested in, I think just try and find out as much as you can about them, go to their events. Lots of people doing online webinars, networking events online now, and really you can just approach them directly. I think when I was at Enfield, if someone had approached me directly and asked me for advice, I'd be very happy to kind of point them in the right direction. And don't be kind of scared to talk to people, because they are just people, and I'm sure they'd be very happy to talk to you. People in the public sector are generally very friendly, I've found, over my year at Enfield as well. So yeah, I think that's probably it.
Great. And one that my colleague here at BFirst would always echo is networking is key. I'm really crap at that, but if you can get better at that and just network like crazy, that is a big one, I think, for me. Before we head off, I think there is one question we missed out, which I thought was really solid. So we're just going to come back to that and discuss it a little bit with the panel before we head off, if that's all right with the panel. And that is just maybe Betty, you can pose that one back to the panel.
Yeah, sure. So this question is around the recent Future Architects Front campaign to end exploitation in architecture industry, particularly amongst junior staff. And I just wondered, what lessons do you think can be learned from the public sector in terms of how to treat staff better and to provide more positive career experiences? And also what you think about the campaign in general.
Anybody want to kick off? I can kick off while you guys stick your hand up in order, and I'll come back to you. I think there's always a lot to learn from the public sector, you know, like what this whole working from home, right? This public sector were doing it donkey's years back. Pay gaps, holidays, like just in terms of progression, I think there was a lot of things public sector is seen not to do right, but in terms of caring for their staff, I think that is something public sector nail. I find they nail in many different ways, from, you know, just looking at progression, your holidays, your benefit, your flexible working. I work 4 days a week, compressed hours. It gives me my Fridays to do my side hustles. And you can see how many side hustles are going on this call today. A lot of them are only possible because of the flexibility that that public practice has offered. You know, before pandemic, if you'd even approached your private practice to let you work 4 days a week compressed and do 2 days a week at home, you would have got laughed off. But that isn't something that you would have got laughed off even long before the pandemic with local authorities. So that's been so far my take on it, and I think the campaign is fundamental in really raising awareness to this issue, because it's absolutely true. Karen, you started. Maybe you go first, actually.
Yeah, I was just like nodding. Obviously, like for me, as I said, like I've gone through a process. I was working like full time for Hackney, and then I started doing a course, and then working on Activate the City at the same time. So I basically split my week, like 2.5 days at the council, and then yeah, the rest on like side hustles or whatever I'm doing. So I think like what could be learned is just in terms of like employees and how long people stay in public sector, is like that's evidence to say that, you know, the sort of policies that they have that are around flexible working and also getting like a decent pay. Like for me, I think the reason why, one of the key reasons why I stopped I didn't think about part two or actually practicing as an architect was around how unethical like the practices are, and especially like when coming out of uni. I remember being offered a job in architecture, and I asked them for like a £100 pay raise per month and for a bus ticket so I can like travel to the office, and they turned around and just kind of said like, you're not worth it, sort of thing. So that's when I sort of closed the door on that, and because people kind of work hard to do this degree, and they should be like, the input of doing this degree should be kind of, you know, the output of what you get from it in terms of pay and benefits and just flexibility should match, and I don't feel it does enough. So yeah, definitely in terms of that campaign and kind of reading some of the letters and stuff that people had written about how they've been treated in practice is like, yeah, it's quite shocking, some of the stuff that's been said. So definitely would support it.
So, Krish, I can see you piping up.
Yes. I think on the kind of practical small scale, I think just respect for timesheets and respect for time worked. And I think the public sector is very, very strong on that. You know, you've worked your hours, you've worked your contract, you know, that's what you've been hired to do. Similarly with wages, you know, that kind of exploitation by through extended working hours, I think is just a real issue. It stems, I think, from private practice, from this kind of tension and anxiety with fee generation and I think, I guess on the macro scale would be, you know, everyone's dream to unionize, but I mean, that's also another benefit of the public sector, is having a very, very strong union, to kind of, you can almost take it for granted to kind of assess wage and salary rises, or you know, all these other things that unions do that you kind of aren't really aware of, but it's really valuable.
Analisa, any thoughts on it?
Yeah, I would just say I really found the working environment in the public sector a lot more open and collaborative than I thought it would be. I think I had a bit of a misconception, maybe just because of the 80s work environment, but that it would be a bit stuffy, and it wasn't at all, actually. I found that it was a lot more diverse than any environment I've worked in before. There was much people from different backgrounds, ages, working people who have disabilities, and it was really quite inspiring for me, actually, the way that people were going about work, and also the life-work balance. I think coming from architecture, as we all know, there are many issues of overworking and clearly exploitation in some cases. So I think we can definitely learn, you know, lessons from that, and how kind of public sector organisations get it right in ways that we might get it wrong.
Yeah, I mean, we're definitely not going to see posts about PAs in the same way Thomas Heatherwick just posted the other day. So lots to be learned, lots of osmosis to have there, and really, really thankful to all of the panelists tonight. Sorry, everybody, we kept you over. I'm always usually a stickler for time, everybody will know, but I think the conversation was just so potent and interesting that most people have hung around still. So thanks to all of you. And maybe we'll just hand over to Hannah to talk a little bit more about what's coming next.
Yes, just a couple of announcements. So I just want to remind everyone that we are recruiting for the Young Trustees, and the deadline is this Friday, end of play. And hopefully this evening's given you a little bit of a taster of what we do and what we want to do more of. And next month, Life Outside of Architecture, we are going to be talking all about public art, which I personally am extremely excited about. I feel like I speak to lots of students, and I always hear people get into architecture because they love maths and art, and then like the art slowly disappears. So next month, we're going to talk all about creating public art and talking to different artists. So I'm really excited, and I'd just like to also say thank you to the panelists today, because I think this has been great, really inspiring. So yeah, lovely to have you all.